London is burning, and no one is sure who will be left standing when the smoke clears, the sound of sirens never stops, and the sky carries the weight of 1,000 black wings. Germany has already swallowed Poland, Norway, Belgium, and France, and now all that stands between Hitler and total domination is one small island. One stubborn nation led by a man who refuses to bow. The year is 1940. And Winston Churchill walks to the microphone in a dim underground war room where every word he speaks must hold the weight of survival itself. The British people huddle around radios and homes, factories, and bomb shelters, clinging to a single voice that refuses to break the silence of fear. This is not the voice of reassurance. It is the voice of resistance. Churchill is not here to offer comfort. He is here to offer clarity. He tells the nation that their backs are to the wall and the enemy is approaching like a tide of steel and fire. He reminds them that France has fallen, that allies have vanished, and that Britain stands alone. But he does not tremble. Instead, he tells them with fire in his throat and steel in his eyes that this island will not surrender. That every street corner, every rooftop, every farmhouse will be a battlefield. If it must, he says, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. And in that moment, across every home and heart, a spark ignites. Churchill is not just giving a speech, he is rewriting the role of leadership. He is not pretending that victory is guaranteed. He is telling the truth, raw and brutal. And then he is asking the people to rise anyway. He is speaking not to generals or politicians, but to shopkeepers, nurses, bakers, and dock workers. And somehow they hear their own courage, echoed in his voice. The factories that were once idle roar back to life. Women line up to weld steel in Birmingham. Children are sent away from cities, while mothers join the civil defense. And every citizen understands that history has placed a burden on their shoulders that cannot be shaken. The power of Churchill's voice is not in poetry or performance. It is in urgency. It is in the fact that he speaks as though this is the last chance for freedom to defend itself. He speaks without hesitation, without decoration. He calls upon the British people to embrace hardship and endure pain, to face terror with resolve. And he does it not through promises, but through purpose. While bombs fall across London and buildings collapse into fire, his voice remains upright, strong, unshaken, and people do not forget that even in the ruins, they are not alone. And then something begins to change because of this speech. Britain does not crumble. It hardens. The Royal Air Force launches night patrols over the Channel. Ordinary men, with barely any flight hours, become fighter aces over Kent and Sussex. Radar stations begin tracking Luftwaffe bombers before they strike. And a nation that should have been broken begins punching back. Churchill's words move faster than bullets. They spread through resistance movements in occupied France. They reach soldiers on the front. They even echo into the war rooms of Washington, D.C., where Roosevelt begins to understand that Britain might just hold the line. The consequences of this speech go beyond morale. They reshape military planning, public policy, and global strategy. After this moment, Britain commits to total war. Rationing intensifies, but so does production. The Ministry of Information spreads Churchill's speech in pamphlets, radio broadcasts, and even motion pictures, and suddenly Britain is not begging for mercy, it is preparing for war, and across the Atlantic corporations like General Motors and Boeing take notice, realizing that the future might not belong to the Reich after all, but to the stubborn island that refuses to sink under fire. What Churchill did was more than deliver a message. He transferred belief from one man into the bloodstream of a people. He took the fear of extinction and turned it into defiance. He knew that Hitler was not just aiming to invade territory, but to erase the idea that democracy could stand against tyranny, and so he made this speech not about glory or vengeance, but about survival, about identity, about the soul of a civilization. And in doing so, he forced every listener to answer a single question: will you submit, or will you stand even when standing feels impossible? But what most people do not know is that even as he spoke these words, Churchill was receiving reports that German forces were preparing Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain itself, and that within weeks the Luftwaffe would unleash the full horror of the Blitz on London. And beyond what he was really doing in that moment was giving the British people the final warning before the storm. What he was saying between the lines was this: "You have one chance to shape the fate of the world. And it begins now with you, with all of us, or it ends forever." The night after Churchill's speech, the sky over London becomes a battlefield without borders. The wail of the air raid sirens cuts through the dark. As searchlights slice the clouds and reveal the silhouettes of German bombers, the Blitz has begun. And for the next 57 nights, the city will be under fire. Entire streets vanish in explosions. Churches collapse into piles of stone, and the air itself tastes of smoke and fear. Yet the people do not scatter. They take Churchill's words and turn them into action. Firefighters race toward the flames. Nurses work through the night, pulling the wounded from the rubble, and families in bomb shelters pass around tea as if defying the war to break their spirit. Churchill moves through the destruction with a cigar in his mouth and a look that refuses to bend. He visits bombed neighborhoods without warning, stepping through debris and speaking to survivors with the same conviction he used in Parliament. He tells them this is not the end, this is the beginning. He reminds them that Britain has been through storms before, and that the empire still stretches across the seas, bringing supplies from Canada, Australia, India, and Africa. Merchant ships carrying food and fuel risk U-boat attacks daily, and yet the convoys keep coming. The nation is not cut off. It is fighting back in every direction. Beyond Britain's shores, Churchill's defiance is changing the map in Washington, D.C. Franklin Roosevelt starts pushing for the Lend-Lease Act, knowing that if Britain falls, America may be next in Berlin. Hitler grows impatient, frustrated that Britain has not broken as expected, and begins shifting his attention toward the Soviet Union. In doing so, he leaves the island standing bruised but unbroken, and that single decision will alter the course of the entire war. The British people do not know this yet, but every night they hold on, they are shaping the strategy of their greatest enemy. Factories across the country roar with production. Spitfires and Hurricanes roll out of assembly lines faster than ever before, built by men and women who just weeks earlier were clerks, teachers, and students in Liverpool shipyards, work around the clock to repair and launch destroyers, while in the countryside farmers push harvests to feed both civilians and soldiers. Churchill's speech has become more than words, it has become policy. Every business, every household, and every hand is part of the war effort. Even companies like Rolls-Royce turn from luxury cars to building Merlin engines for fighter planes. And the message is clear: survival is a national industry. The morale that Churchill forged in those tense days is now a weapon of its own. The Luftwaffe drops bombs, but cannot crush the will of a people who refuse to fear the night in towns far from the front. Elderly men form home guard units armed with little more than shotguns, and determination school children help collect scrap metal to be turned into weapons. The entire nation has internalized the reality that surrender is not an option. The speech that began as a warning has become a covenant between leader and people that no enemy can tear apart. By early 1941, the results are undeniable. The Royal Air Force has not only defended the skies, but is striking back over German territory. The U-boats that once prowled the Atlantic with impunity are now hunted by faster, better-armed escorts. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park begin cracking the Enigma machine, giving the Allies a critical advantage. Churchill knows that without the unity he built through his defiant call, these victories would not have been possible, and yet he also knows the war is far from over. The worst battles are still to come, and the demands on his people will only grow heavier. In private, Churchill admits to his closest circle that the speech was a gamble. He had no promise of victory, only the conviction that if Britain stood firm long enough, the world would rally to its side, and that gamble is now paying off. But there is a darker truth ahead. The Americans may be leaning toward entry into the war, but they are not yet committed, and the Soviets have not yet been drawn into the fight. For now, Britain is still carrying the burden almost alone, and Churchill understands that the next phase will demand even more sacrifice from a nation already stretched to its limits. Then in the spring of 1941, as the war shifts and new alliances form, Churchill prepares another address, one that will not only call his people to endure, but will ask them to strike back with everything they have. What lies ahead will push Britain into deserts, oceans, and skies far beyond its shores. The fight for survival is about to become the fight for liberation, and the fate of millions across Europe will depend on whether the defiance he forged in 1940 can be transformed into victory.